I'm out of here, I said, pulling on my jacket with finality. Fine. Don't bother coming back, Lauren snapped, her voice colder than a November wind. Usually, I'd fire back something sharp, good luck, or, you'll miss me soon enough. As I left. But not today. This time, I kept my words measured, almost polite. Lauren didn't realize it yet, but I meant it. I wasn't coming back. When the days stretched into weeks without me returning, she'd finally get it. Lauren and I had been married for 14 years, and we'd certainly exchanged harsh words before. But over the past 6 months, she'd become relentless, a verbal wrecking ball. Each conversation left me more bruised than the last. It got so bad that I started staying out longer after work, anything to avoid her relentless jabs. Most evenings, I'd sit in my car, scrolling through my phone or listening to the radio, stalling before going inside. Sometimes, I'd wait until Lauren and our 13-year-old daughter, Emily, were already done with dinner. If I was lucky, there'd be leftovers waiting. But lately, even those were disappearing before I could get to them. For context, my name's Scott Kowalski. Technically, it's Michael Scott Kowalski, but my dad's also Michael, so everyone's called me Scott since I was a kid. My dad never went by Junior, which I always found odd. I wouldn't have minded being Junior or even MJ. But no, it was just Scott for me. Or, Kowalski, if you're one of my old friends trying to poke fun. Yeah, I'm Polish, or at least, half. My mom's side is a mix of German, French, Irish, and English, but since I carry the Kowalski name, that's how people identify me. In a town of about 10,000, I'm pretty much the only Kowalski around, so I've become an easy target for the Polish jokes crowd. You'd be surprised how creative people can get. Anyway, Lauren, my soon-to-be ex-wife, has been showing her true colors lately. The realization that I didn't really know her hit me about 4 weeks ago. For months, I'd been retreating, keeping my distance to avoid her cutting remarks. Then one evening, after skipping yet another awkward dinner at home, I stopped at a diner instead. I slid into a booth, grabbed the menu, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I focused on what I needed. It felt strange, but also, right. I was sitting in my booth, staring blankly at the menu, when I caught a snippet of conversation from the next booth over. At first it was just idle chatter, but then I heard a word that made my ears perk up, Pol. How long you been with the Polish missus? One voice said, low and casual. Since they got hitched, came the reply, followed by a chuckle. Heck, I even betted her on their wedding day, and he has no idea. I froze. The first voice was unfamiliar, but the second? I knew it all too well, it was George Collins, my best friend. I tried to focus on what they were saying, but the words became a blur as my mind raced. I forced myself to tune back in just as George said, yeah, we meet up at least twice a month. Scott's so clueless he'd never figure it out. Dumb luck, I guess. At that moment, the waitress appeared at my table. She smiled and asked for my order, but I could barely muster a response. Sorry, I've gotta run, I muttered, grabbing my coat and bolting out the door before George or his buddy caught sight of me. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Lauren, my wife, with George. My closest friend, the guy who stood beside me as my best man at our wedding. It didn't seem possible. To make things worse, George isn't just a friend. He's my go-to mechanic. Well, more like my personal contractor. I run a used car dealership, and he's the only guy I trust to handle the repairs and inspections for every vehicle that comes through. I know what you're thinking, used car salesman, right? Cue the jokes. But business is good. My customers know they're getting reliable cars at fair prices, and if there's ever an issue, I fix it. George has always been a top-notch mechanic, and I've kept him busy and well paid. I even tried to hire him full-time once, but he joked that he'd lose respect for himself if he worked for a Pole. He said it with a grin, but something about it stung. So instead, I brought him on as an independent contractor, though, let's be real, I'm his only client. That arrangement gave me control, but now it feels like it's going to be his downfall. As I drove aimlessly through town, I replayed the conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it. Was it true, or was George just boasting? Maybe he was trying to impress his friend. I even considered hiring a private investigator, but if their meetups were as infrequent as George claimed, it might be a waste of money. I decided I needed answers on my own. Back at home, Lauren was her usual self, calm, cheerful, and completely unbothered. I didn't confront her, I needed proof first. That night, when she fell asleep, I crept out of bed and started digging. Her email was clean, nothing out of the ordinary. Her phone was locked, but I knew her passcode. It was Emily's birthdate. My heart pounded as I opened her messages. There were a few odd exchanges, but nothing from George. His name was in her contacts, of course, he was my best friend, after all. Maybe it really was just trash talk on his part. But deep down, I knew I couldn't brush it off so easily. Something was wrong, and I wouldn't rest until I uncovered the truth. I tried convincing myself it was nothing, though Lauren's recent behavior suggested there might be something else going on, maybe not with George, but someone else. I went to bed restless, tossing and turning for hours. It was well past 2:30 a.m. before I finally drifted off. The next day at the dealership, George was back to cracking his usual Polish jokes. Most days, I let them roll off my back. But today, I couldn't. "George," I said sharply, cutting him off mid-joke, "what do you even know about Poland? Bet you couldn't find it on a map if your life depended on it. You joke about Poles being dim, but I'm pretty sure they could locate the US, maybe even our state. Now, get to work." George's face froze, his mouth hanging open in surprise. For once, he had no comeback. He wasn't the academic type, more street-smart than book-smart, good with engines but not much else. Maybe that's why we got along back in high school. I'd helped him with his homework to make sure he graduated, but now I was starting to question the foundation of our so-called friendship. As I retreated to my office, shutting the door behind me, I mulled over my next steps. Confronting Lauren or George outright wouldn't work, they'd deny everything, laugh it off as paranoia. If I wanted answers, I needed hard evidence. I picked up the phone and called a private investigator in Santa Fe, laying out my suspicions. He listened carefully and didn't sugarcoat the situation. "Surveillance would cost a pretty penny, especially if their meetups are sporadic," he said. "If you're looking for a cheaper option, slap a tracker on her phone. You'll at least know where she's going. Or, you could set up cameras at home. Just keep in mind, good ones are expensive, and if she's alert, she might spot them anyway." The tracker idea caught my attention. "What do you recommend for that?" I asked. He suggested a phone monitoring app and even walked me through the setup process, waiving off any payment. "Consider it a freebie," he said. "Everything I told you is already online if you know where to look. But if you ever need more help, give me a call." I thanked him and insisted on sending him a check for his advice. That night, for the first time in weeks, I actually slept soundly. The following day, I kept tabs on the app while Lauren went about her routine. She worked part-time at the university bookstore, clocking in around 15 to 20 hours a week. She called it her "mad money" and often spent it at the salon or on little indulgences. That day, she went to the grocery store after her shift and then headed home. George, on the other hand, was at his shop for most of the day. Whenever Lauren was at home, George was elsewhere, working. At least for that day, there didn't seem to be anything suspicious. That evening, I tried being more cordial with Lauren and our daughter, Emily. I even suggested we go out for dinner, something we hadn't done in a while. Lauren seemed somewhat engaged, but the evening passed without much fanfare. For now, there was nothing conclusive. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The week went by uneventfully. I kept tabs on Lauren's phone, checking her movements each day, but nothing stood out. It was all routine: work at the university bookstore, trips to the grocery store, and back home. By Saturday night, as she slept, I decided to check her phone for any unusual messages or calls. Once again, there was nothing. I was close to convincing myself that George had just been blowing smoke, trying to impress his buddy with exaggerated stories. It wouldn't have been the first time. George had always been prone to embellishing things, even back in high school. He'd bragged about everything from supposed dates with cheerleaders to imaginary scholarships. Maybe this was just another one of his tall tales. But as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, a thought hit me that made my chest tighten. Emily, our daughter, was born exactly 9 months after our wedding. People often joked about wedding night babies, those kids conceived during the honeymoon. But what if she wasn't? My mind started piecing things together in a way I didn't want it to. If George's claims were true, and Lauren had been seeing him before we got married, there was a chance Emily wasn't mine. I tried to push the thought away, convincing myself I was overthinking things. But the idea refused to let me rest. It gnawed at me, making it impossible to sleep. Sunday morning arrived, and we spent the day on chores, as usual. Lauren took care of things inside the house, and I worked on a few projects outside, keeping my distance from both her and Emily. I was afraid my emotions would spill over if I spent too much time around them. "Something on your mind, Scott?" Lauren asked casually when we crossed paths in the kitchen. I wasn't ready to face her questions, so I quickly replied, "Just thinking about the next car auction. I want to stock up the lot, but it might stretch things thin for a while." She nodded, accepting my excuse without pushing further. It wasn't a complete lie, business was steady, but the auction idea was a convenient way to mask the storm raging in my head. That evening, I floated another distraction. "Thinking it might be time to trade in the Camry," I said. "Might look at something newer. Maybe even something sporty." Lauren raised an eyebrow and smirked. "You, sporty? That's a change." Her laugh was light-hearted, but my focus was elsewhere. What I really needed wasn't a new car, it was the truth. The next day, I took my first real step toward finding it. I reached out to Paul, my accountant and someone I could trust. I told him enough to explain my concerns, though I avoided mentioning Lauren or George by name. Paul, ever professional and discreet, helped me arrange a paternity test for Emily. "You'll get the results in about a week," he said, handing me the envelope with instructions. "Thanks, Paul," I said, trying to sound steady as I slipped the envelope into my pocket. He gave me a reassuring nod. "If there's anything else I can do, let me know." I forced a smile. "Actually, what's this I hear about you looking at sports cars?" Paul laughed. "Yeah, it's cliché, I know, but I'm turning 50 next month. Thinking about splurging on a Mazda Miata." We shared a quick chuckle before I left his office, but the weight of the envelope in my pocket stayed with me. For the rest of the week, I went through the motions, keeping busy at the dealership while my mind lingered on the envelope. When the results finally arrived, I picked them up from Paul's office with a mix of dread and determination. Paul must have sensed my unease. "Whatever happens, Scott, you'll figure it out," he said as I left. I nodded, forcing another smile, but as I sat in my car, staring at the unopened envelope, I felt the gravity of what I was about to uncover. Inside those results lay the truth. Whether I was ready to face it or not, it was time. Though I didn't have a Mazda Miata in stock, I assured Paul I'd find one. "I'll scour the auction tomorrow for a well-kept one and ring you in the afternoon with any updates," I told him as he left the lot. Afterward, I informed my assistant, Anna, that I might leave work early. I didn't explain why. She didn't need to know that I was grappling with the secret that had unraveled my marriage and my life. Lauren's infidelity with George, my best man and so-called friend, was no longer a suspicion. What I overheard at the diner and the patterns I'd observed confirmed everything. The betrayal on my wedding day, followed by their ongoing trysts twice a month, was undeniable. The anger began to boil inside me, threatening to consume my thoughts. I couldn't risk losing control. I knew I needed space, solitude away from everyone. Going home wasn't an option. I feared what I might do in my state of mind, something rash that would land me in jail. I called Lauren. "Hello, Scott," she answered, her voice calm and unsuspecting. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I've got some last-minute business to handle with a dealer in Albuquerque. I'll be staying overnight. Don't wait up for me." "Okay, drive safe," she replied, without hesitation or suspicion. I hung up, grabbed an overnight bag, and hit the road. The 3-hour drive gave me time to think, though not in a way that brought peace. My mind raced through the lies and the betrayal. If Lauren hadn't betrayed me on our wedding day, perhaps her pregnancy wouldn't have been as strained. Maybe Emily wouldn't have been such a challenging baby, and Lauren wouldn't have so adamantly refused to have more children. Instead, George had shattered everything. Seducing my wife on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and continuing their sordid relationship for years, all while likely mocking me as the oblivious Pole. I arrived in Albuquerque around 9 a.m. and checked into a Best Western hotel. Despite owning my business, I couldn't justify splurging on an expensive room with company funds. I didn't need luxury, anyway. The room was simple but comfortable, exactly what I needed. As soon as I entered, I checked the app on my phone to track Lauren's location. She was home, as expected, though the thought of her waiting for me, carrying on as if nothing was amiss, only stoked my anger further. I threw myself onto the bed, trying to calm my thoughts. George had upended my life, and he needed to face the consequences. But what those consequences should be, I didn't yet know. If I acted recklessly, I could destroy more than just my marriage. As I stared at the ceiling, anger simmered again, bubbling to the surface. I needed to regain my composure or risk everything spiraling out of control. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe deeply. I had to think clearly. My daughter, Emily, deserved at least that much from me. But in the back of my mind, the nagging question lingered, was she even my daughter? After much reflection, I decided against pursuing a divorce. Instead, I resolved to leave Lauren with the house and the child she'd had with George. I'd pay off the mortgage, ensuring she could continue living there, but with only my name on the title. This way, she wouldn't be able to sell it or cash in without my approval. I'd also keep covering taxes and utilities, but I wouldn't live there anymore. If she tried to quit her job and lean on the house as an asset, she'd find herself stuck. That decision made, I turned my attention to my business. Though it was registered as a corporation, I couldn't be certain it was safe from her potential claims. Lauren might still demand a forced sale to claim half its value. The thought made my stomach turn. At 9 a.m., I called my business lawyer for advice. "Your corporation status helps," he said, "but it's not foolproof. She might still push for a sale as part of the divorce settlement. You might want to consider selling preemptively to protect yourself." "I can't," I replied, my voice taut. "This business is my life. I've built it from nothing. I'm not selling." "Fair enough," he said. "Let me know by the end of the week if you need more options." The conversation left me shaken. I'd poured years of sweat and effort into building this dealership. It wasn't just a livelihood, it was a part of me, as precious as a child. Unlike Emily, I thought bitterly, the anger bubbling up once more. I pushed the rage down, focusing on the tasks at hand. That afternoon, George stopped by the lot as I discussed the delivery schedule for the 23 cars I'd picked up at the auction. "Hey, Scott, when are those cars coming in? I want to plan out the repairs," he asked casually, as if nothing had ever happened. I clenched my fists beneath the counter, struggling to maintain composure. The auction house will handle delivery. They should be here late next week or early the following, I said evenly, forcing a polite chuckle as he walked out the door. That weekend, I distanced myself from Lauren entirely, throwing myself into yard work and errands. I checked her location on the app occasionally, confirming she hadn't ventured anywhere suspicious. If she noticed my avoidance, she didn't show it. Sunday afternoon, I pulled into the driveway with a sporty little coupe I'd picked up in Albuquerque for a client. Lauren glanced up from the porch as I stepped out. Thought you might want to take a ride, I offered casually, trying to bridge the gap between us. She waved me off with a smirk. No thanks, Scott. I'm not a fan of tiny cars, she replied, her tone dripping with disdain. I sighed and turned to Emily, motioning her over. What about you, kiddo? Want to hop in? No, Dad, she said, crossing her arms. I already get teased enough for having a Polish used car salesman as a dad. I don't need to make it worse. Her words hit like a punch to the gut. The sting was sharp, but I reminded myself it was typical teenage bluntness. Still, it lingered, compounding the weight of everything else I was carrying. As I stood there, looking at both of them, I realized just how far apart we'd grown, not just Lauren and me, but Emily as well. I didn't know how to fix it. Maybe I couldn't. I was taken aback by Emily's remark. Where had this blatant disrespect come from? I glanced at Lauren, who didn't seem the least bit concerned by our daughter's words. In fact, her expression mirrored the same dismissive attitude I'd grown used to. It hit me like a revelation. Lauren had been treating me as expendable for years, and now even my daughter was following suit, despite everything I'd done to support them both. Well, looks like you and your daughter would rather do without a pole around, I retorted heatedly. So, you might as well get used to life without one. Lauren didn't even flinch. Her indifferent demeanor only fueled my anger, and in that moment, I resolved to make her regret treating me this way. From then on, the atmosphere in the Kaminsky household grew colder and quieter. Conversations became sparse, and every interaction felt laced with tension. The following day, Doug, one of my regular clients, came by to inspect the Miata I'd brought back from Albuquerque. He was thrilled with it. After discussing the numbers, he was pleasantly surprised by the deal I offered, and we finalized the sale on the spot. Meanwhile, George eagerly awaited the arrival of the 24 cars from the auction, expecting to start repairs right away. But I kept delaying him, using every excuse I could think of. Over the weekend, I started quietly packing. I spent hours clearing out my closet and drawers when Lauren and Emily weren't home, boxing up my belongings piece by piece. Lauren handled laundry during the week, so she didn't notice how empty my side of the closet had become. By Monday night, my mind was made up. As we sat down for dinner, I looked Lauren in the eye and said, "I'm leaving." She barely reacted, and when she finally did, her response was as rude and condescending as ever. "Good riddance," she sneered. "Maybe someone else will appreciate the Polish used car salesman shtick more than we do." In the past, her words would have sent me reeling. But this time, I stayed calm. "You've made it clear where I stand in this house," I said firmly. "From now on, I'm done standing in your way." The next day, I met with my team at the dealership for a staff meeting to announce a major change. "I'll still be involved in the company," I began, "but only in an advisory capacity. I may occasionally step in to sell a car or two, but I don't want to interfere with your work." To my relief, the team was supportive. They assured me they'd handle the day-to-day operations without any issues, and I could step back whenever I needed. As we exited the meeting room, I saw George leaning against a nearby car, arms crossed. "Hey," he called out, his face showing genuine confusion. "Why wasn't I included in the meeting?" "Because it was for staff only," I replied evenly. "And you're not an employee." His jaw dropped, but I didn't wait for a response. I walked past him without a second glance, already feeling the weight begin to lift off my shoulders. I explained the situation to George after the meeting, watching his expression shift from confusion to shock. I see the cars have arrived, he said finally, clearly trying to change the subject. I'll get to work on them. I gave him a curt nod and walked away, the weight of my decision solidifying with each step. Later, I sat down with Anna to discuss the next steps. I need to make sure the dealership is protected from Lauren, I told her. Anna looked puzzled. Why would you need to do that? Because I've moved out, I said flatly. Lauren doesn't know yet, but I'm not going back. She had an affair with George, and I suspect Emily isn't even my daughter. I think she's George's. Anna's eyes widened in shock. Does Lauren know? Or George? I don't think so, I replied bitterly. But they'll find out soon enough. I'm not filing for divorce, not yet, anyway. I'll keep paying the taxes and utilities on the house so she can't claim abandonment and take everything. But if she files, I want to make sure she doesn't get control of the dealership. Anna nodded solemnly. I understand. Just tell me how I can help. Thanks, Anna. I really mean it. After our conversation, I got into my Audi and started driving toward Albuquerque. About 2 hours into the trip, my phone rang. When I saw Lauren's name on the screen, I hesitated. I hadn't expected her to call so soon, but this was typical. I'd leave for a day or two, and she'd call. We'd talk, I'd come back, things would get better for a bit, and then the cycle would repeat itself. This time, though, I wasn't coming back. Curious about what she had to say, I answered the call, speaking through the car's speakerphone. Hello. Scott, she said, her voice tense. What's going on? Why did you leave without telling me? I needed space, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Space? For what? You're acting like this is some big deal, she snapped. It is a big deal, Lauren, I said, my voice firm. I'm not coming back this time. What are you talking about? She asked, panic starting to seep into her voice. I've had enough, Lauren, I said. I've supported this family for years, and all I've gotten in return is disrespect. I'm done. There was silence on the other end before she began firing off questions. What about the mortgage? The bills? How are we supposed to manage? The mortgage is paid off, I told her. You just need to handle the utilities and taxes now. What about food? Gas? Insurance? She demanded, her voice rising. Do you expect me to do it all on my own? I sighed. Lauren, you've always managed to prioritize what you wanted. I'm sure you'll figure it out. Her tone turned frantic, but I refused to argue. Look, I said, cutting her off, you made your choices. Now I'm making mine. I ended the call and turned my attention back to the road. A strange sense of relief washed over me, mingled with sadness. For the first time in years, I was putting myself first. As I continued the drive to Albuquerque, the sky stretching endlessly ahead, I realized that the weight on my shoulders was starting to lift. This was the beginning of something new, a life that I could finally rebuild on my own terms. I assumed Lauren's next move would be to contact George, her lover, to relay what I'd said and gather more information. It was a predictable pattern, one I no longer cared to stop. When I reached my destination, I turned my phone back on and immediately noticed 5 missed messages. 3 were from Lauren, 1 from George, and 1 from Anna. Ignoring the first 4, I dialed Anna right away. Hi, Anna, I said as she picked up. Sorry my phone was off, I've been avoiding some unwanted calls. I figured, she replied, her tone calm and understanding. Your wife and George called me earlier, asking where you were. I told them you'd stepped out for work, but I didn't give any details. I hope that's okay. That's perfect, thank you, I said, relieved. I appreciate you handling things while I'm out. We quickly wrapped up the call, and I got back on the road. 30 minutes later, I found myself cruising with the top down, relishing the crisp desert air. I hadn't decided where to go next, but north sounded promising, so I headed toward Santa Fe. The next 2 weeks became a whirlwind journey through northern New Mexico, Arizona, southern Utah, and Colorado. I stayed relatively close to Silver City in case Anna needed me, checking in with her occasionally to ensure everything was running smoothly. Once things seemed settled, I allowed myself to head farther west. Of course, Lauren and George kept calling. At first, their messages were tinged with annoyance, then shifted to apologies, and finally, to veiled resentment. I listened to a few out of curiosity but ignored the rest. My travels eventually took me to San Diego, through Death Valley, up to Las Vegas, and down to Phoenix. There was no rush. I spent my days chatting with strangers in parking lots and diners. Some envied me, a man in his 30s who could just pack up and hit the road. Others offered advice on places to see or simply shared their own stories. After about 3 months and 8,000 miles, I decided it was time to head back to Silver City. The road had cleared my mind and settled my spirit in ways I hadn't expected. When I pulled into the dealership, I was greeted warmly by the entire team, including a few new hires. Their smiles and cheers made me feel like I'd truly returned home. Stepping into what used to be my office, now Anna's, I saw her look up, spotting me in the doorway. Her face lit up, and her smile widened as she rose from her chair. "Welcome back, Scott," she said, walking over to shake my hand. "You've been missed." "Thanks, Anna," I replied, genuinely touched by her words. "It's good to be back." Despite the warm reunion, lingering questions and unresolved emotions still swirled in the back of my mind. But for now, I focused on one step at a time. The road had given me clarity, and I was determined to rebuild my life on my own terms. I stood there, the weight of my realization settling over me. Yes, I was Polish, but those jokes, those constant jabs, never truly defined me. They insulted not only my heritage but who I was at my core. "Thank you, Anna," I said earnestly. "You're the primary reason I came back. I had to see how you handled everything in my absence, and I'm pleased to say, you didn't just fill my shoes. You forged your own path." Anna smiled warmly, her gratitude clear. "I had an exceptional mentor," she said. We embraced briefly, a gesture of mutual respect, before she gathered her things to head home. Her husband arrived to pick her up, his expression genuinely content. Watching them together, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name, perhaps loss, perhaps envy. I left the dealership and headed back to the apartment I hadn't visited in months. There was one last confrontation I couldn't avoid. When I opened the door, the first person I saw was Emily. She stood frozen, staring at me wide-eyed. "Dad," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Who's at the door, sweetheart?" Lauren's voice rang out from the kitchen, sharp and tense. Emily didn't answer. Instead, she yelled, "Mom!" Moments later, Lauren appeared around the corner, her face pale and her voice shrill. "Scott! What are you doing here?" Before I could answer, George emerged from the bedroom, wearing nothing but his underwear. "Well," I said, keeping my tone as even as I could manage. "Looks like the whole family's here. Mom, Dad, and child." "What the hell are you talking about?" Lauren snapped, her face twisting in confusion. I stayed calm, though my anger simmered beneath the surface. "This is still my apartment," I said evenly. "I've been gone, yes, but I've continued paying the taxes and utilities. Legally, it's mine. Don't worry, I'll give you until the end of next month to find a new place. Just make sure you take your daughter with you." "What do you mean, your daughter?" "She's our daughter." Lauren protested, her voice cracking. "You couldn't have said it better," I replied with a cold chuckle. "Our daughter." I turned to Emily, who stood frozen in the doorway. "Emily," I said gently, I know you don't like being called Polish. So, here's some news, you don't have to be. Your real father isn't me. It's George. The room fell silent. Emily's mouth opened slightly as she tried to process what I'd just said. Lauren's face went pale, her body tense as she turned to George, whose expression flickered between panic and anger. You're lying. Lauren finally shouted. This is ridiculous. Am I? I asked, my voice calm but firm. I know the truth, Lauren. I've known for a while now. And believe me, I've had plenty of time to think about whether this affair was just something you kept up during our marriage or if I was nothing more than a pawn in some bigger game. Lauren stammered, trying to form a response, but no words came out. I looked back at Emily, who still hadn't moved. Her face was a mix of shock and confusion, and I felt my heart twist painfully. I'm sorry, kid, I said softly. You didn't deserve this. None of this is your fault. Turning back to Lauren and George, I added, you can keep mocking me behind my back, George. Keep laughing about all the Polish jokes you've told to my face. But this is over. You've both gotten away with enough. I left without another word, closing the door behind me. As I walked away, the weight of betrayal, regret, and relief settled all at once. For years, I'd felt helpless, ignorant, and vulnerable to the people closest to me. But now, I was finally taking control. Back at the dealership, I found myself sitting alone in my office, staring out the window. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. That night, I drowned my thoughts in beer, trying to silence the whirlwind of emotions. The next morning, with a dull headache and a sharper resolve, I visited my lawyer to begin the paperwork. I knew I'd have to sell the house and split the proceeds. However, since Lauren barely worked, I wouldn't owe alimony, and with Emily likely not being my biological child, there'd be no child support either. George, on the other hand, had his own struggles. After I cut ties with him, I heard through the grapevine that he'd been trying to secure work at local shops but was consistently turned down. He'd regretted not obtaining his ASC certification, and now his only job prospect was a quick oil change gig at Valine, offering just $13 an hour. I couldn't muster any sympathy. Meanwhile, I contacted a realtor to list the house for sale and formally notified Lauren about the decision. She wasn't happy, but with the eviction notice already served, she had no choice but to vacate before the sale closed. I anticipated a 50-50 split of our assets, and while it stung to let go of the house, it felt like shedding the last remnants of a broken chapter. One evening, Lauren knocked on my apartment door. When I opened it, I saw tears streaming down her face. She stood there for a moment before finally breaking down. Yes, everything's a mess, she confessed, her voice trembling. Then what was it, Lauren? I pressed, my frustration seeping through. What made you betray me? I didn't want to lose him, she admitted, her voice small. And he didn't want to lose me. Well, I said, my tone cold, now you have each other, and your child. By the way, she did a great job with the name. I didn't even realize until later during my travels that Emily wasn't mine. Lauren's eyes widened as she processed my words. I didn't know you knew, she whispered. I figured it out, I said flatly. Lauren's tears flowed freely now. Scott, she said, her voice thick with emotion, I still love you. I let out a bitter laugh. It's nice to hear, Lauren, but I don't think you understand what love really means. Did you ever try to move on? She asked, her voice cracking. No, I replied honestly. I thought about it, but then you left everything in ruins, and I had to pick up the pieces alone. She nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping. I guess now I'm free to pursue it, she murmured. You are, I said firmly. Your choices don't affect me anymore. The conversation felt like it had reached its end, and we parted ways quietly, heading to our respective cars. For months later, we stood before a judge to finalize our divorce. George was present, too, a silent figure in the background. As we exited the courthouse, Lauren turned to me with an unexpected proposition. "Maybe we can grab a drink," she suggested. I raised an eyebrow. "You mean, like old times?" She nodded, a faint smile on her face. I hesitated for a moment before replying, "Sure." "The traditional way." "Certainly." Despite everything that had happened, there was a strange sense of closure in her words. The past couldn't be undone, but perhaps, in some small way, we could part without bitterness.